the ultra-Orthodox community where I grew up was very focused on Jewish values and studying of Torah. And there definitely was a gender difference between boys and girls. Girls were more educated and trained to be mothers, to be, you know, trying to help you gain the skills that you would need at home with children, and boys were more geared towards studying Torah. The school system was completely separate, but there was always a lot of talk about values and about living according to your values and according to Jewish values. And that's something that for me was a big takeaway from my education, that I really felt like, as a Jewish person specifically, I have a bigger obligation to live by my values and to bring good things into the world. And that's sort of how I understood my Jewishness, was that I needed to serve as a model of some kind for something good. In the ultra-Orthodox community, I think that appropriate or good or model behavior sometimes falls into very rigid categories. But I think that naturally, by being curious, I was interested in learning more broadly what Orthodoxy has to say, what Judaism has to say about how to be a good person, about how to be a light unto the nations, what that could mean and how that could manifest itself. And I think, you know, I came to understand over time that there were a lot of opportunities for me to try to make change or try to improve things in the world in ways that weren't necessarily traditional within the Orthodox community, but in my opinion really still jived with the ideals and the values that I had learned growing up. After I finished my social work degree and my husband finished his studies in the States, we're Zionists. You know, we really felt like now is an important time to be in Israel, and like Israel is an important place to be and a place that needs our contribution. And we decided to move pretty much right away to Israel. My husband got a position in Haifa, and we moved to Haifa. I was thinking of starting a PhD, and I went to the University of Haifa to the professors there to talk with them about what I might want to study. And the dean of the school said to me, you know, there's a huge social problem happening in Israel now, and it's something that doesn't have enough research being done about it, and you should really consider, with your background, you should really consider it. And I said, you know, what are you talking about? And he was like, you know, the African refugees. And I never heard that there were any African refugees in Israel. I had no idea. And I was like, oh, why is that a problem? Like, isn't Israel great to refugees? Like, I was completely convinced that Israel is a place that was founded by refugees, and that for sure, if anyone managed to get here, that we would, you know, definitely welcome them with open arms. And I was very enthusiastic about how great Israel is. And I left his office a little bit skeptical when he was, you know, painting this really grim picture. And I went and I started to kind of research it with myself. And when I came across ASSAF, which is an aid organization for refugees. And they happened to have a job opening by miracle, which didn't happen very often. And they were actually hiring for the first time a social worker. They had never had one, and they decided that they wanted someone to provide services for the refugee community. So I went for an interview, and a lot of other people did too. And I called Orit, who was managing the psychosocial department then. She was the only person in the psychosocial department. I was the first hire. And this job was in Tel Aviv, and I was living in Haifa. It involved a pretty substantial commute, although for Israelis that's crazy. For me, that was just like, oh, whatever. It's just like going downtown in Toronto. It's no big deal. And she realized that I was enthusiastic, even though she also was very confused by me. She was like, even during the interview, she said, are you Orthodox? Like, because somehow in Israel that's supposed to be associated with like certain political beliefs. And I guess she thought maybe I was some kind of spy or some kind of like, she wasn't very clear to her what I was doing there, because everyone else was like, you know, a young Tel Aviv girl in jeans who, you know, is not married and certainly not religious. But that was it. I started working there, and I became exposed very much to what was happening in Israel with the refugees, and to the specific, problems and issues, and also very quickly to a lot of the government policies. And at first it was very shocking for me and very difficult for me. And as I continued to work there, I would meet more and more volunteers who were coming to do a year in Israel from South America, from the States, from Europe, and who were having that very same conflict that I had sort of in my initial time there of, how can I be someone who supports Israel and who believes in Israel and see these very discriminatory, very difficult policies happening? Like how do I find myself in that scenario? Because I was raised and educated that Israel's great and maybe even infallible, and suddenly there's something really different here, and I don't know how to process it. There were women, children, men, psychiatric issues, emotional issues, post-trauma, no food for tonight, where should I sleep? Just, a very, very vast range of different challenges that people had. And it was a matter of trying to focus in on the individuals who needed the most intensive support, and that's who I would be taking care of. Case management at ASSAF was a very challenging thing to do because it's like trying to be a social worker with no tools. Like when you're working within the system and you have someone come in and you need to figure out what to do with them, then it's pretty easy. You say, okay, you have a psychiatric problem, let's get you to this hospital, or you're going to die, let's get you to this hospice, or you don't have where to sleep, we'll put you in a homeless shelter. And there was just very clear answers most of the time. And working with refugees, all of those services weren't available to them. And that was something that was very heartbreaking for me to see, that there were people in a developed country with a lot of resources around, and the resources were in place and the system had the resources, and because of the paper they were holding or because of the color of their skin, they weren't able to access those resources, which meant that sometimes it was a matter of taking a homeless person and calling up a friend and getting them to sleep on our couch. And sometimes it was a matter of finding host families for people who had been injured at the border who had nowhere to stay. Often it was taking money out of my pocket and taking someone to go eat something. Or, ASSAF also had a financial help system where we would give people just very, very, very small amounts of money because there was no other alternative. Like, giving people money isn't such a great option. It's better to give them services, but when the services don't exist, then you don't want them to go hungry, so you'd give them, 100 shekels to buy groceries for a month. And that also was very difficult in some way, because even as an aid worker or as a worker in a human rights organization, it feels really, really bad to give someone 200 shekels for a month who's disabled and in a terrible situation. It's like trying to put a very teeny tiny Band-Aid on, a life-threatening wound. Like, it's something that really just doesn't answer the problem. And that wasn't easy for me in terms of, it's very, very frustrating to feel like I don't have what to offer. And over time, I came to learn that there were ways to find people help. And it was something that, had to be invented. But what was very tragic for me was that often Christian organizations were the ones who would offer hospice, or that would offer someplace, homeless shelters for people. And when I would try to call a Jewish organization, and I'm Jewish and I want to feel like Jewish people want to do these things. Coming from Canada and seeing that all the hospitals are Mount Sinai this and started by Jewish people, and particularly for the reason because Jewish people couldn't access other services. And now these places have become public hospitals that serve the needy people and anyone who comes. And to see that in Israel people had no access to health care and no access to any kind of services, and these were the Jewish Jewish organizations that I believed in and that I supported throughout my life, that my parents supported. And I would call them and the phone would get put down. Like nobody was willing to talk to me. And when I started to call, the nun from this hospital or the priest who runs, that homeless shelter, and I got a positive response, I felt to myself like it's really a big pity that in our country that I believe in, that could be a model of what a real democracy can be, what a real Jewish country could be, that these people couldn't find any help within the Jewish system.